and we were discussing in the break, and maybe some of you in law enforcement can help us with this. We have the Atlanta police shooting over the weekend. Rayshard Brooks, unfortunately, has died and was killed with 2 gunshot wounds to the back, and of course that now adds to all the other going on because it is a 27-year-old African American man encountering 2 white officers. Now this one is a little bit different based on the protocol that the police officers may or may not have been taught, which is again why it's important for us to have the conversation we're having now and try to address some of the issues that may be there. Is that it is, and you can see in the officers' cameras that it looked strange because he was called. They were called because he was blocking the drive-through at Wendy's. Is that correct?
He was fell asleep in the line.
And from everything that you see from the sobriety test and all that, they felt like that he was intoxicated, and everything like it was just going, pretty normal. And then when they go to handcuff him, he begins to fight the police to the point that he even commandeers one of their taser guns, is running away from them, points the taser gun back at them, I guess to shoot a taser at him, or I don't know what he was thinking. We'll never know. And then he was shot as he was running away, pointing the laser gun at him. So that leads to obviously we know that he fought the law, and you don't want to do that. And, his actions certainly contributed to this. But once he was running away and all he had was a taser gun and nothing else, was this more force than was necessary, and it should not have led to a death. And that's kind of where we are, which now leads us to the conversation of when it gets to protocol, does it vary from department to department, city to city, county,
state to state,
county to county? So because some people are saying that they were taught in their protocol that if a person resists arrest and they attempt to disarm you and then they do anything,
if they get anything of yours,
baton, whatever,
right,
taser, gun, whatever,
you put them down.
You shoot, or that gives you an opportunity to you have to use the deadly force. So I don't know. It's always the optics of somebody running away, being shot in the back. Also, is never good. I don't think.
Well, there's a lot of elements in here, and I
don't. Rick, I know the officers that have to deal with things. They deal with so many of these things day in, day out. You never know what you're up against. You don't know who's got a gun, who doesn't. But when you see that clip of him running across the parking lot, it's very disturbing at that point. And of course, with everything going on now, but the question really was how are these engagement protocols decided? Are they department to department, as you mentioned, and who decides those and how are they enforced?
And I wish we could. I know there's so much emotion, there's so much going on, but I wish we could have the conversation that we need to have, and maybe we can. I keep praying that we can. Of course, one of the things we got to stop trying to do is to solve spiritual problems by telling God he's not welcome. We're telling God to exit this, and then we're trying to solve problems without him, and that's never going to work. But
you just get more problems.
But let me go back to this part. First of all, we need to talk about the obvious, and that was that there was something that took place that we all can obviously see. Now, we have to? We can't be afraid to say that if this particular man were Asian, Latino, white, Native American, or African American, no matter what, and this same scenario had taken place, would it be the same end result? Because it's not like this was, making this racially motivated. If we can prove that point, then we certainly should. But in this case, can't we talk about that any of us, if we've been arrested by officers in this situation, which, you would hope you wouldn't do anything that would get you in this situation, like, blocking a drive-through,
right,
intoxicated, but that shouldn't necessarily lead to death. But what I'm saying is, can we just talk about the training? Because, it's easy for all of us to say they obviously weren't in any real danger. We've got law enforcement out there right now that probably feels like that they are marked more than they've ever been.
Oh yeah,
not just
absolutely.
people watching them, but people who want to harm them.
Right.
And so, and I'm not saying that this should have ended this way, but if the officers come back and say, we fully implemented the way we were trained in this situation, and the way Mr. Brooks responded. If anybody responds the way he did, our training is to shoot. So if that
is that the right thing to do?
If that needs to be changed, then we need to have that conversation.
And I watched the entire video, and there's no confrontation between them at all. The police are very professional, and even the man who got killed, he didn't act like he was being threatened, or they were standing there having a conversation. By watching that video, if you'd have said, now at the end of this somebody's going to get shot, I wouldn't have believed it by the way they were interacting. They were not being hostile. Either side was being hostile at all.
But then something
and then when
happened.
they go to put the cuffs on him,
then he goes
off.
And at one point, I just watched it. At one point, he's punching. He's throwing punches, and
look at him standing having a conversation, and it went on.
got
and
no
on,
issue.
and both of them were being very respectful.
Yeah, I'm like you. There didn't seem to be any animosity between the law enforcement officials and this man on either side.
No,
until they went to put the handcuffs on him,
and then it went.
And then he goes into a frenzy and starts fighting the police.
What were they putting the cuffs on him for?
DUI.
What were they? Was it DUI?
Yeah, because
he blew in the breathalyzer.
I think it was.
See, he didn't want to at first, and they calmly talked about it, and calmly he goes, Then he agreed to do it. It was really watching the interaction between them, and like I said, I'm talking about both sides. Neither side was being aggressive at all.
Right.
So I think that's what was so surprising.
Yeah, exactly. And I've also heard on the officer side. Okay, I know he's running away, but he's aiming the taser back. Or let's say he hits the officer and disables the officer. What's to say he's not going to come get the officer's gun at that point?
Right. I heard that argument.
But in the climate we're in now, they'd already fired the officer before.
But watch this right here. See, we're full blown punching now.
Yeah.
And so they think they're in a fight now.
Yeah,
and they were, and I don't know why that fight ever started.
It was strange because, like I said, neither side was being aggressive at all.
Yeah.
All right, we have some folks in law enforcement. We'll try to clear up and get some ideas on this.
So let's go to the phones. Anonymous out of Alabama, talking about the incident over the weekend involving Rayshard Brooks and two officers in Atlanta. So we're talking about police protocol in Atlanta or other places. How does that work? So go ahead. You were going to speak to that.
Hey guys, how are y'all today?
Good.
We're good.
Hey, yeah, I was a police officer in Alabama for about 15 years. I got out of it about a year ago, basically because of everything that's going on right now. It just wasn't worth it anymore. But yes, in Alabama, we are taught that in the academy. If somebody takes one of your weapons, you're authorized to use deadly force to defend yourself. And it's because you may not know what he's going to do if he incapacitates you with that taser. He could kick you in the head, knock you out, and beat you to death, or he could take your weapon and kill you or anybody else. And I'm hearing a lot of people say, well, this was just a DUI. They could have walked away. Look, guys, these cops aren't Boy Scouts. You have to have a rough side to do that job.
Yeah, because you're dealing with some tough situations.
Yeah, you don't just walk away. When the guy runs away, you're okay, we'll give up. We'll come back tomorrow. It's not like that.
No.
And they have a job to do. They've got to do it, and this war on cops has got to stop. You're seeing guys walk away that are great at this job, and this country is losing them.
No, I know. No, this overall attack on law and order in general, and that doesn't mean that we don't take law enforcement and say, let's look at how we do the job and see if it can be done better. But this deal of abolishing law enforcement, defunding law enforcement, we'd all be better off if they weren't around, that is lunacy.
Yeah.
And not in this world, man. There's some bad people out there, and you certainly want something between you and your family and people that are just of every walk of life, of every gender, that of every ethnicity, that are dangerous people. And now, if we want to, we need to hold law enforcement accountable every time they do something wrong. But I guess in this particular case, and I know there's people, because of what's going on, they're approaching this completely different. If this was not going on, if we were not in the state we're in right now, the whole narrative would be this guy got himself shot because of his actions. And this is what the police are told to do, and they did their job. That's the way it would be. Now, right now, you can't do that. So everybody's falling all over themselves, say, oh, my gosh, this was terrible. They shouldn't have done that. Everybody is doing a CYA. Oh, my goodness, we got to hold them accountable. And probably the very same people that had trained them how to do this will now abandon them.
Right.
And say, oh, man, they're going to be a scapegoat when really the truth is they might have been doing exactly what they were trained to do.
And that's why we always should be, because of the police officers, and again, an incredible job they're asked to do to begin with. Right. That we got to have our policies right, we got to have our training right, we got to have the technology to do what we need to do. And I certainly understand why that would be the policy, but it just seems like, when you're in a gunfight with somebody, obviously understood, but the optics of somebody running away and being shot in the back is not a good one for anybody.
No.
And there's got to be a better way to do that.
Even if they're attempting to fire a taser.
Right.
But then,
and I understand the danger in that. I got that.
But then you go back to this because they can't win. Okay,
Right.
So then they let this guy go. Then I think they were saying 0.18. Then his intoxicated self is running through your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Comes through your door. He's out of his mind. He's intoxicated, and then he caused some kind of problem at your house. You know what you hear? Well, why didn't y'all bring him down?
I know. There's no way to win.
There's no win.
And we've got to have a way to win. That's the problem.
Right.
We got to figure out what that is. Because I'd sent y'all some videos over the weekend. The point was being made that there's a lot of people being shot by the police for various reasons.
Yes.
And but a lot of them you never hear about because it doesn't fit the race protocol now that gets the headlines.
No, you're right.
And
We need to
doesn't mean that that's any less important, but we never hear about it.
No, it can't be just about race.
Right.
Because if we have people in law enforcement that shouldn't be there, then everybody is dangerous. Now I understand there's people say, well, you're in danger, but if you're African American, you're in more danger. And if we can take the data and prove that narrative, then you know what? That needs to be dealt with too. Because there are some people that do have a racial bias that shouldn't be in law enforcement, and those people should be dealt with. But I wish we could have level-headed thinking to go, all right, here's case A. In case A, we believe the police did everything the way they should have done it, and the person ended up in losing their life because of their behavior, not because of overreach by police or an ineptness or a bias by the police. Here's case number B. Oh, my goodness. Looks like this person used excessive force, and this person should have never been killed, a la George Floyd. And we have a evil person here who killed someone that they should not have killed, and we got to hold this person accountable. He must pay a price for this, and people like this should be removed from law enforcement. But still we don't have a racial bias because we don't know yet. Maybe. He may just be an evil person. And then you get over to case C. There's clearly a racial bias here.
Right.
Why can't we take them A, B, and C? Yeah. But what we're doing now is they all have to fit in one narrative, and that's not going to help because let me tell you the part you're not thinking about. When it turns out that the narrative doesn't support that, then when it really happens, nobody believes it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They go, here we go again.
Right. And that's the problem. And we already have law enforcement. See, we also have to say there's a case in our state, in our city. We don't know the truth yet. It looks like there's possibility that this officer was drawn to a hotel and assassinated. Ambushed.
Right.
Okay. But
Haven't heard a lot about
because of this person got upset. These people were upset about law enforcement in general, and they just took out an officer, and they may have taken him out, because he was white. I don't know. But we don't talk about it. What about Daryl Dorn? Here he is, 77 years old. He goes out to, and he's African American, so that would go over in the African American deaths. Well, he gets killed protecting a pawn shop by another African American. So if we're going to have a conversation, it's got to be a comprehensive, full conversation, or if not, we're not going to solve the problem. And then also the narrative that should be listened to and should be heard and should be addressed is then just kind of, we know what all this is. And then you get into the worst one, the patronizing too. Mm-hmm. What have I got to tell you to leave me alone?
Yeah.
I don't really think it's serious. I don't take you serious. I'm scared of you, and I'm not bigoted. I'm just terrified now. And now I'm so afraid of you. What have I got to tell you for y'all to leave me alone? What have I got to recite? How have I got to get down here? What sign have I got to put up? What have I got to put on Twitter? What have I got to put out on social media? So you don't think I'm bigoted and you don't think I'm racist. I don't take any of this serious. I'm just trying to be done with it. See, none of that is positive. We don't get anything done. And those attitudes are everywhere right now. And I mean, and how about this? Don't be afraid to go to the website of Black Lives Matter and look at the organization, not the sentiment, not the phrase Black Lives Matter, because that phrase is true. The organization. And if you agree with the things that they hope will happen to our country, then certainly you should support them. But if you don't agree, you can still stand up and side by side by your African American brothers and sisters and talk about the value of life without supporting the organization Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, it's two different things.
It's two different things.
Yeah.
And it's like we're not allowed to have that conversation. I'm going to have that conversation, and I'm not going to be disrespectful, and I'm not going to be rude, and I'm going to try to have it. But I really want to solve the problems. But let me tell you what the answer
Or
is.
make progress.
Let me tell you what the answer isn't. To take this constitutional republic, okay, to take this constitutional republic and destroy it into some kind of Marxist, socialistic,
Anarchy.
confused anarchy society run by those who have the most firepower. We do not want to live in that world, and we don't have to. We don't like, you know, I mean, it's just let's have a real conversation, and let's have a 2020 conversation. 2020, because we got to see if we can solve this from 2020 going forward. I can't do anything about what happened up to 2020, but we can go to 2020 and go forward and make the changes that need to be made comprehensively with law enforcement, with organizations that are trying to hijack, a movement and turn it into a political situation or an agenda. We can do all that.
Rick and Bubba.
To the phones we go. At 9 minutes to the top of the hour, Jeff's in Texas. Jeff, welcome to the Rick and Bubba Show, and thank you for your patience. Go right ahead.
Hey, guys. Just kind of weigh in. I'm a cop. Just kind of give some background on how use of forces are looked at. So if we look at the Supreme Court case, which is Graham versus Connor, probably the most impactful for use of force guidelines, okay? And that basically says that we look at use of force objectively reasonable, like what the officer at the time can perceive as a threat. And that's why we can't compare two videos of two separate officers in
Right.
two different circumstances.
Exactly.
Okay?
Right,
Because
right.
there's one now kind of going around where there was a white guy that got a taser and he didn't get shot. You know, you have to weigh in a lot of factors. There's a lot of gray area. The only thing black and white in policing is the car.
Right.
So, for example, like you have to weigh in that officer's physical ability, his training. Departments, like it's not federalized, so every department doesn't get the same training. And then policies and use of force is guided by the law, which you can look up the law for Alabama. It varies state to state, and then there's federal laws. Now, the department policies can be more restrictive than the law, but they can't be more loose
Right.
than the law. So
Right.
you can't supersede the law, obviously. So,
Gotcha.
and there's no law that says, hey, if they grab your taser, you shoot. That's not exactly the way. It's just you have to. Does that officer at the time objectively, reasonably, just determine that that's a threat and that's a potential deadly threat? For example, if he does get tased and he takes his gun, and there's nothing saying that guy wasn't running for, a more advantageous position. We really don't know, and we'll never know his exact thought process through that encounter. All we know is that officer is going to be held accountable, and he's going to have to articulate what he thought was objectively reasonable at the time.
Yeah, and that's what we're saying. And certainly it's terrible optics in the times we're in for an African-American man to be shot in the back, because that's the headline you're going to hear. But just like most all of this, there's much more to it than that, as you're saying. And you know what? We may find, if we go through our due process, the officer should not have done what he did. And if that's the case, he should be held accountable. But we're living in this soundbite headline world. And I've got a statement I want to make, and I put it on a bunch of signs, and everything that happens, I'm gonna make it point to this statement. Man, life is so much more complicated than that. Until we're willing to take time to work through it comprehensively, I don't think we're going to solve anything.
And one more thing, Rick, is shootings. Most law enforcement use of the forces, even if it's not a shooting, a lot of those are presented to a district attorney's office and even presented to a grand jury. You just don't hear about it.
No, you're right.
A lot of these things are measured and stuff, and that's everyday citizens that judge these encounters and decide whether or not to bring charges against the officer. You just don't hear about every encounter going to grand jury, but a lot of them do.
Okay, about a week ago, and refresh my memory, because I'm you can't say shooting from the hip anymore, can you?
No, you can't.
There was several officers fired in Atlanta who were African American because they fired their taser at somebody, and it was called deadly force with the taser, right? Didn't they refer to that as misusing deadly or whatever the term? Seemed like, because I remember the headline thinking, wow, I'd never thought about a taser being deadly force. And I thought that was so, but if you use that, that logic here, but I don't know. It just seems like we've got to have some other way to apprehend these people without it getting to this level.
I want everybody to learn too, and this is not an excuse, but we need to learn. I'm talking about now to citizens, okay? And I know we have some big things we got to deal with, and we need to. This is me now talking to my children, okay? Look, if he had just simply got in the car, went downtown, slept it off, got up, he probably went free to go the next day with some sort of bond or whatever, and been gone. When this is the thing about being intoxicated, because you don't think clearly, okay? Hey guys, you think it's no big deal to have too much to drink, but look how it can end.
Yeah.
So we need to also teach lessons about abuse of alcohol when law enforcement arrive, what you do and you don't do. All of these things can also be helpful, because I don't think it's like you're saying, these decisions have to be made in such split seconds.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's at night. You don't know what's going on.
Can we
it's
all
hard
agree?
to do.
Can we all agree the best way not to be in this situation is not to put an officer in that position where he's having to make these decisions about you?
Let me ask you this too. Let me ask you this too, because I've seen a lot of videos where people will now post their encounters with the police, and a lot of them are white folks too. Okay, where they will almost antagonize the officer. Like if they've been pulled over, an officer will ask them their name. They won't give them their name. Do you have to do that? Do you have to identify yourself and present ID?
Yes.
And if people don't do that, what can they do?
So for example, you're required to identify yourself. If you're stopped for a lawful purpose, you're required to identify yourself. You don't have to necessarily produce an ID, because if you don't have one on you at the time, but you generally have to provide a name, a date of birth, and potentially an address.
Right.
So that's why you see a lot of people getting arrested that are doing the sovereign citizen type thing, is you have to provide, or you'll see them provide just that bare minimum of information. They'll give your name, they'll give their date of birth, and then they'll just leave it at that. They won't say anything else. And you're technically not required to. That's fine. But if you're stopped for a lawful purpose, you do have to provide identification. And I've worked in Alabama and I've worked in Texas, and it's true there, and it's generally true. I can't think of a state where you're not, if you're stopped for a lawful purpose. But to weigh back in a couple other things is Graham versus Connor also said that we don't look back at these incidents in 2020 hindsight, because now everything's open. But we have to look at what the officer reasonably observed at the time. And then one other thing is Bubba said about the taser use. I'm not familiar with that Atlanta thing, but a taser, if you don't really know how to use it, it could very easily become deadly force if you're actually hit with a taser. Because so generally, if you pull the trigger of a taser, it's going to shoot your probes, and you're going to get a 5-second ride. But you can hold that trigger down, and you can let that thing go as long as it wants. And you've seen incidents. There's been incidents where a person has been on drugs and they were tased and they've had an adverse reaction, or where they were tased for so long that they had an adverse reaction, because it's meant to incapacitate your muscles, but it could definitely be used wrongly and turn into something else. So you have to look at that, as well as it's obviously that suspect probably never been to a taser certification course, and how is he going to use that taser against that officer?
Yeah.
To his point and Bubba's point, from 2000, this was in an article yesterday in regards to what you were talking about, Bubba. From 2001 to 2012, 500 people in the U.S. have died after being shocked with a taser during arrest or while in jail. So it does happen where people are killed with a taser.
Another thing I'm getting from law enforcement, another place too, they say this whole defunding of the police. They say if you defund the police, one of the first things they'll no longer be able to afford, body cameras. There won't be any. So, because then they're going to have to work on a budget, and some things got to go, even if you don't abolish it, if you just defund it.
If you defund the police, you're going to get a lot of people killed.
Yeah.
That's all it's going to happen.
Top of the hour.
Rick and Bubba, Rick and Bubba.